we are protecting people's freedom of speech. We support peaceful protests. I actually worked for the ACLU in the Wayback Machine, and we need to make sure people have freedom of speech.
That's Councilmember Maritza Rivera speaking to me on Seattle Channel just before a massive No Kings political rally in the city over this past weekend. How well did Seattle fare with an estimated 70,000 people exercising their free speech in the streets? And what's next with another No Kings rally expected in July? Plus, a focus on housing this week with affordable housing providers in trouble across our region and the fledgling social housing developer in Seattle in the midst of some financial problems and an investigation into its leadership, too. All this and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle Channel, and I'm joined by my co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, as we spoke about last week, you're more of a vegetable garden kind of guy, but I still wanted to wish you a happy Rose Awareness Week, and I hope you're celebrating responsibly.
Yeah, we tore out a rose.
Oh, no, that doesn't sound like celebrating.
No, but I mean, this was a few years ago, and even though we dug it all out, it just grew right back. I think they're kind of weeds at their heart, but they are pretty.
Yeah. There's a little biodiversity kind of in the mix there. They'll bring in some pollinators. So I hear what you're saying, David. Thank you for letting me know of your travails there. Thanks to everybody listening out there. And a big thanks to the patrons of the show, especially Eric and Groucho. Really appreciate your input over Patreon last week. Very helpful there. Patrons can send in questions, access Patrons First content, and so much more. Just $5 a month to start. You even get your own Seattle News, Views, and Brews stickers. So we'd love to have you on board there. Great to have you as a patron. Also, a final shout out to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get her going here. Time for Right Here, Right Now. David, I wanted to take a look back at this past weekend. An estimated 70,000 people gathered for a so-called No Kings rally in Seattle, pushing back against what they see as an authoritarian figure in President Trump. The Seattle Times reported this was one of the largest rallies in city history, but there wasn't even a report of a broken window. Now, this is not to downplay two serious cases from over the weekend. A 39-year-old man shot and killed during a No Kings rally in Salt Lake City. Plus, in Minnesota, a Democratic state lawmaker and her husband gunned down in their home in what's being called a politically motivated killing. Two other state lawmakers were also shot and wounded. But I was just trying to look in Seattle, David. Were you surprised to see such a low-temperature event with so many people coming to the No Kings rally in Seattle?
It kind of reminded me a bit of the Women's March from 2017.
Which had around 100,000 people, yeah.
Yeah, and so, there's a lot of pent-up energy in this particular region. I mean, it's no surprise that the area around here is not particularly Donald Trump friendly. And I think that there was, this march to me, it seemed kind of the family-friendly march. I know a lot of kind of people's parents and kids and stuff who went out to this. And, I think sometimes when people hear about protests, they imagine the kind of late night, more chaotic version. Mm-hmm. So then when presented with the opportunity of a kind of, if there's a sort of tipping point at a certain point where there are enough people that there's kind of safety in numbers and it becomes this sort of peaceful event. I think it was permitted. That always makes a difference.
Right.
So no, I wasn't surprised. And like I said, I think more than anything, it was people who are frustrated with the Trump administration who live around here kind of seeking solidarity and other people who feel the same way.
Yeah. There are national organizers of these rallies going on. It's a group called Transformative Justice. They've said they're planning more protests on July 17th to honor civil rights activist John Lewis, who died on that date in 2020. A bridge has been named after him, you will remember, in Seattle's Northgate neighborhood spanning over I-5. I wanted to ask David what you might anticipate on July 17th. As it turns out, I looked at the protest website. It already lists an event in Calumet in southeastern Washington, Wahkiakum County. I see you. But it just feels like we're going to see more protests ahead in our state, in Seattle, other cities across the U.S. I heard you say this really didn't hit a breaking point here in the June month, but I wonder what happens in July and August as, I guess, tension continues to build, or how do you look at it?
Yeah, I think these planned protests tend to be pretty orderly. And again, they seek out permits.
Yeah, they're different.
Department sort of ushers them where they're going. I think it's more the kind of direct action, smaller protests that are the ones that tend to kind of maybe get a little more out of hand. We saw some protests down in Tukwila around an ICE facility because there were reports of sort of unusual requests to
Mm,
migrants to check in on the
right,
weekend.
right.
It stood out as kind of out of the ordinary to some immigration lawyers, and that attracted the kind of more, that led to clashes between the
Yeah, there was
protesters.
some pepper spray that was used by police, right?
And so, I think in some ways we're a lot of us are wondering, and maybe this is what you're asking,
Mm,
is this going to be a 2020 replay? I don't know the answer to that. I think
mm,
LA had some of those vibes. And we haven't seen anything close to that yet in Seattle or the Seattle area. I do think the fact that 2020 was during the COVID lockdowns probably
hmm.
made a big difference. There were a lot
Yeah,
of people spending a lot of time thinking about what was happening in the world and
yeah.
trying to get out of their apartment and get involved. Be interesting to see if we hit that kind of critical mass again with some of the more kind of widespread, less planned protests. I think it could go either way.
Yeah, yeah, I'm interested to see what happens. So, definitely a lot still ahead. We will see what happens on July 17th. And again, yeah, some unplanned protests certainly on the docket, I would imagine, for the rest of the summer here. I did want to get back to an issue that we touched on last week, David, the council's work to change landlord tenant laws and how affordable housing providers are really the people pushing for that change. This week in the Seattle Times, you and Greg Kim went a little deeper on what's happening with these providers and found a system really in crisis here. And before we get into how the city is responding to this, can you tell us how our local affordable housing providers got into this situation?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't new exactly. Affordable housing providers have been kind of ringing the bells for a while, saying that their finances were just not working as they were pre-pandemic. There were a few things that kind of spurred us to do this deeper story. One of them was noticing that a number of affordable housing providers were putting buildings up for sale, and that to me stood out because there's not affordable housing don't providers don't get into this business to flip buildings. They get
Right.
into this business to build or manage buildings. And so if they are selling, it is almost certainly or getting rid of, transferring assets in the case of one of them, it
Hmm.
is almost certainly a sign of some kind of financial troubles.
Yeah.
Most of the buildings being sold will remain affordable. There's some covenants around them that require that. But the point is, it was, I think in some people's views, it was maybe speculative that that the housing sector was facing financial struggles. But when I see sales happening, that is a fairly clear and concrete example that the challenges affordable providers are saying they're facing are in fact real because they're not making those decisions lightly at all.
Right. They have expenses
And
that are
then
going up, right? Isn't that the big driver here?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few of them. One is expenses, total expenses, which is insurance rates have gone up a lot. Security and maintenance costs have also gone up a lot, partially because, there's a lot of complexity there. I mean, I think fentanyl and kind of
Mm,
rise in mental health challenges are part of that. The pandemic, I think coming out of the pandemic, there were just not the kind of check-ins and interactions that there had been before. And so, finally you're able to kind of enter these buildings and then you find that they have degraded quite a bit and maybe didn't get the maintenance they should have.
yeah.
And then, yeah, insurance costs are going way up. I think kind of reflecting some of that.
Mm,
But then the other side of the coin is that almost unanimously, tenants, these providers have not been collecting as much rent as they used to. And, despite how we kind of maybe view affordable housing, it is a model that is dependent on rent collections. It cannot survive if the people are not paying their rent,
and
even
this
though
was
those
the
are.
big push behind, let's change the eviction laws, et cetera, in the city of Seattle, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's again, the data is pretty clear that this is a sector-wide issue. And so, the reasons behind that are varied and will depend on who you ask. But a lot of providers, as we have talked about before, looked to the regulations in Seattle around eviction moratoriums and their limited ability to kind of screen out people that they feel like could be a problem. We're restricting their ability to collect rent. There's disagreement around that, but that is really the motivating factor for why they were pushing for these changes that Kathy Moore was working on for a while, and now Mark Solomon has taken on.
Yeah, and I just wanted to go a little further down that path because change some of those policies. Sure, I imagine that could help in some ways for these affordable housing providers, but it almost feels like the city needs to do more than that because that policy change isn't going to move the needle completely when it comes to these larger economic factors that these housing providers are up against.
No, and the premise behind those policy changes is essentially that these providers want greater freedom to make evictions. But if you look at the number of evictions that are happening, they are already quite high. So these evictions, despite the limitation, there are in fact evictions happening right now. And so to your point, the underlying issues are so deep that just making these policy changes is probably not going to make a difference. And so then for the city, the question becomes, look, we have a lot of money coming in to build affordable housing, but do we, instead of building more affordable housing, spend that money to basically prop up the housing that we already have? That's tough, because then you got to ask, well, is that just how the system works now? Do these affordable housing providers just need ongoing city support to survive? And if that's the case, then that's not an ideal situation either for anybody involved. It's a fairly, some people are calling for basically a system-wide review of what kind of affordable housing we're building and how, which is a much more complicated conversation to have than perhaps rolling back a select few city policies, but probably the one that needs to be had.
I would agree with you, because you talk about the money that Seattle's putting into affordable housing. It is putting in more money, but it has these additional costs it needs to catch up on. So the projects that were already planned for and funded, they're needing to pour some more money in there. That can turn into some difficult conversations when the city is really trying to move the needle on creating more of this housing. So definitely a conversation ahead. And thank you, David, to you and Greg Kim for jumping in on that story. All right, coming up, another look at the world of affordable housing with a focus on the troubled launch of voter-approved social housing in Seattle. We've got the story next on Now Hear This. More problems surfacing this week with Seattle's social housing developer. This is the system voters approved in 2023 to create mixed-income, publicly owned housing that is permanently affordable for tenants based on their incomes. Then, earlier this year, Seattleites approved a measure to fund this program with a tax on businesses who have employees making over $1 million. But now, the city of Seattle is proposing a $2 million loan to tide the developer over before the developer collects these millions more in revenue starting next year. I spoke with the social housing developer's CEO, Roberto Jimenez, back in March about his financial concerns, especially over the volatile nature of the tax on big businesses that will fuel his agency. Here's how he responded.
I don't take a position on where the money comes from. This is what was proposed. I was brought in to administer the organization. And so if the money doesn't come from here, then it needs to come from someplace. But this is desperately needed. I think this can be a major factor in the affordable housing situation and just middle-income housing situation, the shortage here in Seattle.
David, there's a lot to unpack here. I want to put the financial bit on the side for a minute, because several members of the Social Developer Board have actually resigned over complaints about Jimenez, accusing him of racism and bigotry. Sounds like there's an outside investigator looking into that now. Can you tell me what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much summed it up. It's a couple of the board members felt like they were being mistreated by Roberto and expressed that, and as a result, resigned. The developer has now hired, like you said, an outside investigator to look into the complaints.
Okay.
So they're not saying a lot about it beyond that. But when I talk to them, I think it's sort of reflective of how new of an organization this is. It's reflective of the fact that the board is all volunteer while Roberto Jimenez is paid. And so, we see a kind of internal strife sometimes on city commissions and boards and things like that, and it comes up. But this, I think, is amplified because it is about to get a lot of money. It's and its marching orders are fairly significant and serious, and there's a lot of hope being poured into this social housing developer for offering a new model of affordable housing. And so I think because of that, there's a lot of internal tension as they kind of work out like what kind of organization they are and how they function. And, when you talk to other folks in the board, they say, this is just kind of part of the becoming a new organization. It's growing pains. And, I'm sorry that these people feel this way, but this is kind of the result of people who have strong feelings about an organization kind of competing for how that should look. And that's fine, but I think it is worth pointing out that this is kind of the argument that was made against giving this tax in the first place, right, which is this is a new organization that's still figuring out what it is. So the reality is they have a fairly clear timeline of kind of when they need to figure out exactly all of their administrative and board functions, because come 2026, and really now that this bridge loan has come through, right, this is an organization that's going to have a lot of money coming in and is going to have a pretty efficient and clear pipeline for getting it out the door and putting it to use.
Yeah, we're talking about what could be as much as $50 million a year coming into this organization. So that's something to take a look at. Can you go a little bit more into that $2 million loan? How is that helping the situation? What's that going to allow the developer to do?
Yeah, I mean, the loan, I mean, it makes sense. This is a body that's about to get a lot of money but doesn't have it yet. And so it's a tax that was passed, so you can't you can't dream up a more secure loan than this one because you know the money's coming. So this loan will be paid back, and it's basically an advance on the money that's coming in. And I think that makes sense for the organization because they're still trying to kind of get they want to hire financial officer,
Sure.
and they want to, technically you're supposed to be paying their board members. They want to start doing that. And then they want to start, scoping out land and properties that they can buy. The only sort of nuance to that is there's some debate over whether or not the city just owes this developer more in startup funding than they have paid out already. Some of the kind of people involved in the organization say that the charter said that the city should budget more startup funds for this year, and they didn't do that. The mayor's office is saying, nope, our obligation on that end has been met. So there was some kind of dispute there, but this, in theory, this $2 million should kind of give the organization a shot in the arm toward actually, getting people into buildings.
Yeah, that's the whole key here, and that's not going to happen for another year at least. Was that your indication from talking to the developer?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of broad scale adoption is probably a few years away, honestly.
Yeah.
But they're hoping to buy one existing building and kind of get people in there as sort of a proof of concept. And so, I think that's the first stage is find buildings that are in decent shape to purchase by the developer. And then some number of years down the road, in theory, get more into construction and actual development.
Yeah, not in construction mode just yet. Thank you for that, David. I did want to talk about one last housing with you, if I could. The full council tackling a ban on the use of algorithmic rent fixing. So Councilmember Kathy Moore sponsored this measure along with Councilmembers Rink and Strauss. Unanimous support in committee. But what does it mean? Heidi Groover was writing about this in the Seattle Times. The city wants to stop landlords from subscribing to software platforms that take local rent information and then recommend rent prices. The fear is this is using proprietary information somehow and amounts to collusion among landlords to keep rents elevated. So, David, this type of software, and RealPage seems like the name of the most popular platform here, is already facing several lawsuits. So, what do you see the city trying to do here with this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I will note first that this is the fastest I've ever seen a piece of legislation move. It was introduced basically last week and got a committee vote and is now went to full council. It got delayed in full council today. It was punted a week. But this is, I think that is reflective of a sort of Venn diagram of politics here. It's been a progressive priority for a while to ban these kind of algorithm platforms. But I think there's some interest too among some of the more moderate council members, particularly, Kathy Moore brought this, and Kathy Moore has been pretty vocally skeptical about the push for more kind of broader market availability to developers to be a solution to the affordable housing crisis. And I think a bill like this kind of goes after the housing challenges in a different way that does not include sort of mass upzoning or whatever it might be.
Right.
It's interesting. The state had considered a similar bill, but tabled it because of concerns about basically liability, how they'd be sued. And Moore has really leaned super heavily on that process as what the city should adopt, which is an interesting argument considering the bill was never adopted. And it does kind of raise some questions about, is the city going to get sued because of this? It seems like the signal is probably yes. If they pass it, they've been sued before and it's been fine. They have good lawyers and everything. But, it's interesting for a few reasons. Kathy Moore was quite upset today that it got delayed. She was really eager to pass it.
Well, so she's almost out of office, so that makes sense. Yeah.
Counting down the days until she's gone next month, and clearly a high priority for her.
Yeah. And I was going to try to ask about what impact this ban would have. I saw some of the background on this, that RealPage. Well, San Francisco has a similar law to this when it comes to this rent algorithm system. The city of Berkeley is getting sued over this as well, and Seattle could potentially be, I guess, another target here. That it sounds like that's definitely on the table.
Yeah, it does. I don't know enough, I don't know if I don't know what the evidence are that this is leading to higher prices. Not to say there isn't any. I just am not
Yeah.
intimately familiar with it. It might be an issue. There are also lots of other issues in the city's housing space. The number of new housing units being permitted is at basically an all-time
Right.
low.
Right.
Also, probably worth pointing out that rent has basically stayed flat for the last 2 years, as a lot of new housing has come online. So, if that I would say is perhaps a counter argument. If there was truly a price fixing scheme, you would expect that to continue to rise. But I think it's the fact that this is private data that they're depending on. So there's just not really any oversight mechanism to know that the prices that are being spit out are truly reflective of the market, rather than a lot of landlords kind of grouping private data that the rest of us can't see and coming up with something that's unfairly beneficial to them.
Yeah, that is definitely the concern here. I just appreciate that you didn't try to explain what an algorithm actually is, because I don't think we've got an extra half hour to do that.
No.
David, thank you so much for making that happen. Coming up next, those traffic backups you're used to seeing on I-5 north of downtown. Turns out we're just getting warmed up on what's expected over the next several years. That's right, years. So pull over, take a deep breath. It's time for What's Next. David, I noticed an interesting story on the council's Transportation Committee agenda this week. The Washington State Department of Transportation is giving the city a heads up about work on the Ship Canal Bridge. Now 60 years old, apparently hasn't had significant repair work in about 40 years. It's a very busy spot, too, on I-5. 240,000 cars per day and 200, count them, 200 emergency repairs since 2019. So the plan is to have 2-lane shutdowns over the next 2 years during the summer, and then some full northbound closures this year in July, the 18th to the 21st, and in August, the 15th to the 18th. So 2 weekends there. I wanted to pull back on your knowledge of transportation reporting from a couple years ago. What does a full northbound shutdown of I-5 on the Ship Canal Bridge do to the city?
Yeah, boy, this is we'll see. It's kind of a test in some ways of, I think we saw this when the viaduct first closed. It was sort of a test of the kind of theory of, like, if you take roads away, people will find other ways of getting around, and therefore we should not be
carpooling, etc. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it'll certainly be a test of that if the city can function. I think there will be a big push to inform people about that, and that will probably help. I think the new light rail extension will probably help with that, but it seems kind of hard to imagine that it won't be fairly ugly. This is work that has been forecast for a long time. It's been punted some as the state's transportation budget has kind of run into dire straits, but you don't find any disagreement that this is work that needs to be done, and the longer the state waits, the more expensive it gets.
Yeah.
So they got to do it eventually.
Yeah, makes me think about a lot of these housing discussions we've been having over the past couple weeks. About the only thing that really made sense to me out of this was that the bridge would be fully open during the World Cup from end of June into July next year here in Seattle, but then it is right back to work. I just wanted to talk about the future of this project, because we are talking about years potentially here. And then, of course, I think about Seattle, which has a lot of old bridges in it. This one just appears to be getting really beat up, and it's 60 years old. I know that sounds old, but Seattle has a lot of older bridges than that too out there.
Yeah, I mean, this was Alex Peterson's whole thing,
right?
When he was in council, was the city's bridges are in fairly bad shape. That's true. That was kind of, I think back to the previous transportation levy before the one that was passed, and there were a lot of, kind of hand-wringing about whether or not the promises were kept there. I think the levy ended up being more successful than some people expected it to be, but the one place where it was fairly glaring was around bridges. They had made promises of fixing up a number of bridges, and then there was a little bit of a smudge of like, well, we fixed as many bridges as we said we were going to, therefore keeping our promise, but we just chose the easier bridges to fix, leaving the complicated and really expensive ones. So it is an issue that the city has not super taken head on, and council former council member Alex Peterson had proposed, I think $100 million in bonds to get the city ahead of this, and that didn't go anywhere. And it's a big issue without kind of any plan for dealing with it.
Yeah, we're talking about a state project here with the Ship Canal Bridge, of course, with I-5, the city. But still, I think it just comes to mind for me of all the different older bridges out there, like Fremont and Ballard and Magnolia too. So, yeah, it's just something that, you're going to see it in terms of traffic this summer, folks, as you're traveling north of downtown. David, time to wrap up. I wanted to ask you something, because as much as we like to agonize over the Seattle Mariners, pity the poor Colorado Rockies. That team this year has the fewest wins through 70 games since the 1899 Cleveland Spiders, who are infamous for only winning 20 all year long. The Rockies could even break the modern-day record set by the Chicago White Sox just last year, who lost 121 games. So Colorado is now on pace to lose 132. I just wanted to ask you, what do you make of seeing more and more teams with these crazy losing seasons happening here? 100 losses used to be a shocker, maybe not so much anymore. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what to make of it. I mean, I think because the baseball introduced all these sort of anti-tanking rules because the Orioles did that for years, basically. Apparently, just seemed to intentionally lose so that they could get high draft picks. You can't really do that anymore. I do think there's just a power imbalance in MLB, which is some teams don't want to spend money. The thing about the Rockies, though, is they do spend money.
Yeah.
I think the Rockies are not interested in winning baseball games. I think they've got a stadium in a beautiful location with cheap beer, and people show up. If you look at their attendance, it's always good. They just don't have any outside motivation to be good at baseball. And, everything you ever read about them is they just are in the Stone Age as far as baseball goes.
It's crazy, man. Like, if I'm a hitter, I want to go there. It's like, I will hit some home runs here. But, crazy to watch that. Well, watch for them coming up in September at the end of the season. They're coming to Mariner Town, so we'll see if the streak stays alive here. Thank you, David, as always, for joining me. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. If you're listening, help out, why don't you? Consider a pledge of $5 a month or more on Patreon to be a patron. Please and thank you for doing that. You can hear this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.